The peace talks between Israel and the Palestinian Authority have started once more. What could make this time different? We'll find out next on The Line. This is On The Line, and I'm Aisha Tanzeen. American Secretary of State's intense shuttle diplomacy has brought both Israelis and the Palestinians to the table again, with a commitment this time, though, to stay there for at least 9 months. Today we'll focus on what could be done differently to achieve results and get beyond the past stalemates. And for that, we have with us Hussein Ibish, a senior fellow with the American Task Force on Palestine, and Edwin Black, a human rights investigative reporter and author of many best-selling books, including IBM and the Holocaust. Welcome to On The Line.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
From both of you, starting with you, Mr. Ibish,
Sure.
9 months, is there particular significance to the time frame?
I think really it is structured around not being too soon and not being too far. It's a nice middle ground so that people won't be looking for immediate results. It gives the parties space to achieve something. Okay, I don't think that there's much confidence that there'll be a full final status agreement within 9 months, but it's far enough away that it buys everybody a period of quiet time where there can be negotiations and diplomacy away from the public eye, to some extent at least, and it sort of forestalls immediate expectations at the diplomatic register. It does raise the issue of expectations on the ground. That's a whole other story.
So, Mr. Black, we saw intense diplomacy on the U.S.'s part. Do you think the U.S. is willing to keep it up for 9 months to make sure that this time when people come to the table, they take something from the table?
Well, I'm not so sure it's really in the hands of the United States. Really, whether it's 9 months or 9 days or 9 weeks doesn't really matter. They can achieve peace in a minute if they want to. They know all of the issues. It's a matter of when the parties are going to run out of steam, run out of money, and have enough inducements to make peace. After all, they've come all the way to Washington. It's just a 5-minute drive if they're in Jerusalem to meet each other.
If they want to meet each other, exactly.
Whether this is stagecraft or diplomacy has yet to be seen. But this much we know. If the parties really want to make peace, they know how to make peace, and it will come in the twinkling of an eye.
Mr. Ibish.
I mean, I'm not so sure. I think there are some issues. I think you're right that we know the basic outlines, but there are some issues, particularly on Jerusalem, and the Holy Basin in particular, that do require some creative ideas and some more fleshing out. They are moving the talks back to the Middle East. Some in Jerusalem, maybe in Ramallah, maybe
August 14th.
Yeah, August 14th. So the Washington thing was demonstrative. It was theatrical, and it was designed to give the Secretary of State and the President the due credit.
Well, at least we understand that part of the theater.
Right.
So it was just the preamble.
That's right.
But I don't think it's the main act, and I don't think it's the door prize.
You're right.
So here's the question. As Mr. Black has just indicated, Mr. Ibish, a lot of skepticism on the ground. This totally seems like a rerun. We've seen this movie many times over. What could or is different this time around?
Well, I mean, in terms of the basic structural relationship between the parties, nothing really.
That's correct.
Except that as we go further along the process of increasing the number of settlements and increasing the Palestinian anger about that and whatnot, as the sides drift further apart and the constituency that believes in a two-state solution, that believes it's a good thing and that believes it's possible, dwindles, we're moving further and further away from the potential. So there isn't, what's changed is the urgency is greater than ever, and the difficulty is more because the constituencies opposing it are stronger. But that's really the only difference.
There's been no change in the urgency. You and I have both been covering this for too many decades. And the one thing we always hear is, now is the time, is urgent.
Because it keeps getting worse. But I take your point.
Let me ask you this, though. We talk about urgency and how the sides are drifting apart. This used to be the issue in the Middle East for Europe, for U.S., and now there are a whole bunch of other issues in the Middle East. So has it kind of lost its luster as opposed to what you're saying?
Yes and no. In the sense, in the immediate term, it has, and in the long term, it hasn't. And this is because the Arabs are capable, and the other Middle Easterners, the Turks, the Iranians, the Israelis, etc., are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. The most immediate crisis in the Middle East right now is Syria, where over 100,000 people have been killed, and there's a raging civil war. No one knows what's going to happen there, but there's not much the United States can do about that, or is willing to do about it. I should rephrase that. I think there's plenty the United States could be doing more and doesn't want to.
They're hesitant.
And they're very hesitant, very risk-averse on Syria for reasons I understand but don't agree with. On Egypt, which is perhaps a harbinger of the way many of the Arab states may go, there's not much the United States can do or anybody outside of Egypt to influence
it. There's shuttle diplomacy going on there as well.
Yeah, but we just don't have much leverage.
That's theatrical diplomacy.
It's an internal Egyptian dynamic that's driving that, and I think it's very hard for anyone outside to really influence it. In this case, it is, though, in the long run, still center stage, because it still defines more than any other issue the way in which most Arabs, across geographical lines, class lines, religious lines, ethnic lines, all kinds of other lines, view international relations, and especially view the role of the West in the region. So as long as this remains, as long as this remains unresolved, it's going to be a long-term problem, and it's going to be something that anti-American extremists, terrorists, and others, or anyone, in fact, can use accusatorially.
We've heard it many times over in khutbas and in hate speech and in all kinds of other speech.
It's like a megaphone sitting on the road that anyone can pick up.
So, Mr. Black, let's go back to what we started the show with. This sounds like a rerun. What could be done differently this time to make sure it's not a rerun?
Only one thing. Either the promise of the future has got to be better than the tyranny of the past, or it's not going to change. And that means that the Palestinians need to confront, and the Israelis need to confront, the truth, if I could say that term, and that is, you can have God on your side, history on your side, or the future on your side. Right. And if you can't get those three on your side, then there is no way to convert a legacy into a partnership of peace.
And irony is both sides will claim they're all on their side.
Yes, but it doesn't matter, because there's a profound effort now to steal the history of the region, to reinvent it. And so many people don't understand the true historical ramifications of the history that it's hard for them to proceed into the future. I have one thing that I think would change everything. And actually, Secretary of Kerry has been talking in this realm. He's got a $4 billion carrot out there. There's breaking the impasse with the Israeli and Palestinian billionaires. If people can look to a better life, and one of the ways people can look to a better life is if Palestine gets rid of its chief cash crop, its chief industry, which is terror. Now let me explain that.
Okay.
Well, there's more money in terror, protest, and confrontation than peacemaking. And when we can change that equation...
I just think that's not true. I mean, so in the West Bank, that's not true. There's been, according to Shin Bet, look at the Shin Bet figures for the past 2 years, there was no Israeli killed last year at all.
You're using the wrong measure.
No, that's a perfectly good measure. You're talking about an industry of terror. The biggest industries, the biggest GDP indices in the West Bank are agriculture, tourism, and high tech. They're not violence. Okay, but I think it is true that both sides need to recognize each other's narratives, and I agree with you that economic incentives are important. The $4 billion Kerry is talking about with appropriate oversight and accountability and transparency so that it doesn't feed into a narrative, unfair or fair or whatever, of Palestinian corruption, and accompanied with greater access and mobility for the Palestinians and greater and at least continued, if not enhanced, security cooperation. All that stuff can augment this diplomacy and serve as a
let me break
kind
it down.
of
So you're both
safety
making
net.
some interesting points. Let me break it down. Both sides will have to give up something.
Yes.
It's a negotiation. If there's
That's
to be
not
a
what was
compromise.
just said.
No,
but
What
that's
was
true,
just
though.
said was talking about the economic sector.
the economics.
But it's still
and you're
true what you're
saying
saying.
that you're saying that there's an economics of violence there. He's saying that it's not just violence.
And I'm
We
going to
understand.
correct him right now.
Okay.
And the way I'm going to correct him is you spoke about the high-tech sector. You
Right.
spoke about agriculture.
I did.
First of
And
all,
tourism.
unemployment in tourism. Are you talking about Gaza or West
The West
Bank?
Bank. West
Okay.
Bank. Only West Bank.
There is an unemployment rate in many parts of the West Bank and Gaza of about 20%.
Right.
Second of all, you can earn a couple of $100 a month as an ordinary technocrat, an employed person on the West Bank. But you can earn a $2,000 a month salary from the West Bank, from the PA, amounting to 6% of the PA budget by stabbing an Israeli in the heart, which was just done a few weeks ago as an example.
Wait.
Okay.
Just a second.
If you're talking about the remits to prisoners, this is something that's been understood.
Well,
It
let's
goes
talk
to
about
all
it.
but it goes to all
It
prisoners.
doesn't go to all
Okay,
prisoners.
It does.
It does. You mean it goes
does.
to a car case?
Yes, it goes to everyone who's imprisoned by Israel as a remit and has been understood by the Israelis and not objected to since 1993. Now, the biggest part. Let me
Who
correct
you
you on
mean not
something.
objected to?
The Israeli government has never objected to payments to all Palestinian prisoners held by Israel,
So
remits
we
for their
are,
families.
again, so
but hold
this-
on, let me say something here.
6%.
No, let me say something. The biggest part of the Palestinian budget is not only public sector, but the security sector, which cooperates and coordinates with the Israeli security sector to keep violence to a minimum. And you really need to listen to the Israeli security officials and their testimony about how effective that has been in keeping violence in the West Bank
Okay,
to
let
an
me-
absolute
let me-
minimum.
let me quickly interject.
What
Let me
you've
quickly
said is
interject. Mr. Ibish and
absolutely
Mr. Black.
correct,
Yeah.
Let
but
me
it
quickly
doesn't
interject.
cancel out the fact that you can make 4 times as much killing an Israeli
Let me
than working in a
interject quickly
factory.
here.
Nobody-
Let me very quickly interject, Mr. Ibish and Mr. Black. So you're talking about issues that are, of course, deeply entrenched. I have very little time, so very quickly, if both sides had to give something up, what would they be willing to give up? Give me 20-second answers.
I think there has to be a reciprocal exchange on sovereignty in Jerusalem. There has to be a compromise on Jerusalem. It's going to be difficult for the Israelis, and a compromise on refugees. Israel cannot have sole total sovereignty over all of Jerusalem. That's it, period, as they claim. But the Palestinian right of return needs to be compromised on because Israel will not let millions of Palestinians return.
Mr. Black, 20 seconds.
It's hard to say it in 20 seconds since it's been more than 20 years. But I think that if the Palestinians were to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and I think if there could be some proper definition of what refugee is, so it includes the real refugees and not their grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. I'm certainly not a
It'd be
Polish
nice if
refugee.
Israel defined what a
I
Jewish
am
state
so
meant, which
sorry.
they've been
How
unable
about
to
the
do.
world?
I do have to wrap
The
here.
Israelis couldn't
I
agree
know
on a
it's a
bill
very
this year,
interesting
you know.
discussion, but I do have to wrap here and let you guys go. I want to thank both of you, Hussein Ibish of the American Task Force on Palestine and Edwin Black, author of multiple best-selling books. We have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk to Dr. Walid Phares, who advises the Anti-Terrorism Caucus of the U.S. House. Stay with us.
Voice of America.
1,500 hours of news and information.
Educational and cultural programming to more than 134 million people
worldwide each week.
Listen to us on radio.
Watch us on television.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter.
And through your mobile device.
VOA.
We're dynamic
and consistent
In bringing you
the most reliable information
in 43 languages.
Tune in.
Tune in.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Aisha Tanzim. We're talking about the resumption of peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians and what can be done differently this time. Our guest for this segment is Dr. Walid Phares, who advises the Anti-Terrorism Caucus of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's also the author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. Welcome to On the Line.
Thank you for having me, Aisha.
You just heard a very heated discussion. What I want to ask you is, what can U.S. do differently this time?
Well, first of all, in Washington, as we all know, you have multiple positions. You have the Congress position, you have the administration's position, you have the negotiators' different views. But there is a unity around the following principles. Number one is that no more violence. Every American do not want to see violence between Palestinians and Israelis. And number two is to move forward, but to move forward very cautiously. Now, there's one element that is important that has happened this time, did not happen before. The region has changed. And you heard from the guests that were here presenting Palestinian and Israeli views. It's the same story. It's about Jerusalem, return of refugees. But what has changed, in my view, is the fact that those radical elements who usually sink the process in Israel and in Palestine are busy elsewhere. Gaza and Hamas are busy with the future of the Brotherhood in Egypt. Hezbollah in Lebanon is busy in Syria. So this is an alignment of planets that Mr. Mahmoud Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to seize to achieve some goals.
Now, here's a question that I also asked them. Secretary of State Kerry put a lot of pressure on both sides to come to the table, a lot of shuttle diplomacy. Is he willing to continue the pressure for 9 months straight at the same level?
He will continue that pressure as far as we understand. But if he puts some pressure, then the two contending parties will have to give him something. This is a very interesting triangle. Each one will give a little bit, so the triangle keeps moving and create a mechanism of its own. For example, the Palestinians coming to the table, PLO in this case, or PA in this case, will distance themselves a little bit from Hamas. Then the Israelis will have to give them some reward because you are distancing yourselves from the violent part. Then we're going to give you something that you could take to your public opinion and gain. And when that is done, then the dynamic will begin. 9 months is what the Americans think it would take.
But the Israeli government will have to do something too, because the Palestinians already put a couple of conditions. They want the 1967 borders. They wanted the release of prisoners, which has happened. So how much is Israel willing to compromise?
Oh, absolutely. In my analysis, I meant that Israel, as soon as the Palestinians will come to the table of negotiations, distinguish themselves from the radical forces, the Israelis will have to give them something. Now, what is that something? I don't suggest that the Israelis or Palestinians will begin discussing the final status. They will fight immediately. If they're going to discuss immediately the future of Jerusalem or the return of the refugees, they're not going to go anywhere. It's confidence building. For example, the Israelis will have to strengthen Abbas's authority on his own people, allow him to have some sort of leeways and accesses and have international aid coming, Israeli aid going. When he feels comfortable with his government, he can give services to his people, then he can come back further to the table of negotiations.
Now, here's my question. With the U.S., what kind of carrots and sticks is the U.S. holding this time around?
Well, on the one hand, it has a lot of carrots, and the carrots has always been for Israel, the strategic relationship, the military relationship, the funding of Israel's multiple sectors, and for the Palestinians, the same thing, plus the fact that the United States can coordinate an Arab support to the Palestinian side. We have allies in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and soon to be Egypt and elsewhere. So that would be an important advantage for the Palestinians to have the U.S. working with them.
And what about the sticks?
The sticks are going to be simply, we're not going to get involved anymore, and then you're going to fight again against each other. The Israelis will say, well, there is terrorism, and the Palestinians will say there's Israeli occupation.
Same old story, but here's the complaint from the Palestinian side, at least, which is there's not a real stick for Israel, because from their point of view, the Israeli citizens are living a certain life. They don't feel the effect of this every day, and they're okay to go on like that.
Look, there are 2 points to this issue, and I agree that those points are relevant to the people. For example, the Israelis will tell you that that's true that we have a high-level socio-economic level. We don't have security freedom. We always feel insecure. Palestinians will tell you we don't care about security as long as we don't have justice. So at the end of the day, one will have to give the other for both of them. They have both of them to be convinced that this process is for both of them.
And the 9 months, do they have some kind of reverse timetable? You have to at least reach this point by 3 months and this point by 6 months?
I haven't read anything about that. I am sure that those architects, and now the special envoys and others, will have 3 months or 2 months goals. But it seems to me it's more psychological. It's to make both sides, and in this case, the Palestinians, more confident in coming to Washington to the table of negotiations.
And Hamas is so far out, and as you said, the PA has to distance itself, but at some point they will have to be brought into the circle, because you can't just leave Gaza out.
Well, you've got to hear what the Palestinians are saying on this point. The gentleman who was here at the panel said, let's make a clear success in the West Bank, because Gaza is linked to many regional issues. So if Palestinian West Bank is a success, then the people of Gaza would like to be like the West Bank. That's why he was urging the person with the Israeli point of view, please give us something for the West Bank. Let us be a success, economic success. That alone will draw probably what I call a Gaza Spring, whereby there will be political changes and then maybe reforms among the more extreme elements.
And the $4 billion carrot that Mr. Black mentioned, do you think that's a big enough carrot? And what exactly would that entail?
Look, the details will be always discussed by the parties on the one hand and between the United States and those parties, and I think there will be more than that money, but if there are political results. In the past, we always sent donations and grants, and nothing was really happening on the ground. I think this time they're going to be one little carrot, results, another little carrot, and then results.
And do you feel more optimistic this time around?
As I said in the beginning of our discussion, I feel more optimistic just because there is an opening, there is a window where the more radical element is busy. I'm not saying they're outside, they are busy, so Israelis and Palestinians should be smart enough, create a hub for themselves, so when that window will close, they have achieved something.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Dr. Walid Phares, an advisor to the U.S. House and author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. And thank you for joining us. Please send us your questions or comments or watch our past shows on our website, voanews.com/ontheline. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of On the Line.
What's 15 feet deep, filled with 300,000 gallons of water, and could help save your life?
There's been a lot of experiments here through the years doing a lot of really, really cool studies.
Creating and diffusing a tsunami on the next Discoveries and Breakthroughs. While a big wave may get your attention, it's a tsunami that causes real damage.
Before the 2004 tsunami, America was not really affected or concerned about tsunami at all.
Dr. Solomon Yim runs the Hinsdale Wave Research Lab at Oregon State University. Here, they create and study tsunami waves.
So what we're doing here is trying to quantify the response of the flow to the vegetation.
Dr. Heather Smith is testing whether trees and plants can slow down the impact of an incoming tsunami wave. The machine here pushes a 15 by 12-foot steel wave board back and forth. The result, 8,000 pounds of water pressure on the far end.
What we emphasize is actually building a more resilient community.
A community with better bridges and buildings that can withstand the pounding waves. When a tsunami wave reaches land, it's like a car hitting a speed bump. A bigger wave forms to get over the bump and crashes on shore. Those waves can be anywhere from 1 to 30 feet in height. By simulating cause and effect, crews hope to discover how to build stronger homes and bridges.
It's not just the structures have to be resilient. The entire community have to be resilient.
For Dr. Yim, this $20 million lab produces prevention fueled by experiments like Heather's. What's done here may stop this destruction in the future. Alex Kane reporting.
Hello, I'm VOA reporter Chris Simpkins. 5 decades ago, the United States was in a period of turmoil as it struggled to resolve long-entrenched discrimination against African Americans. I recently traveled to Jackson, Mississippi, the scene of many civil rights protests, to see the lasting impact one of the movement's leaders, Medgar Evers, had on the country. He was murdered for his beliefs, but his wife and others are keeping his ideas alive. Here's the story. 50 years ago, Medgar Evers was assassinated fighting for equal rights for African Americans in Mississippi. His wife, Merle Evers, knew his life was in jeopardy.
He had a cause that he believed in, and it was one that he worked for, knowing all of the sacrifices that would have to be made.
Medgar Evers was a field secretary for the nation's largest civil rights organization when he was killed by a white supremacist in June 1963. He was 37 years old and had been the target of numerous death threats because of his work registering blacks to vote, leading demonstrations, and documenting brutality against blacks by white racists. Claude McInnes says Medgar Evers' death galvanized support for the movement to wipe out racial discrimination in the South.
It pushed people. It made people much bolder. And so, yeah, that's what, it had the opposite effect. It just put people in a mood that we don't care anymore. You can't kill this person just and think something's not going to be done by it. So it really, I think, probably did much for that movement. As him being alive.
Hezekiah Watkins worked with Evers. He says his murder led older people to join the teenage students at the civil rights demonstrations.
After his assassination, we was able to pick up individuals who was 20 plus, maybe 20 to 30 years of age, who got involved in the movement. I think the death of Medgar inspired all of us to go a step further.
It was through his life and death that I felt that I had to help make a difference.
Flonzie Goodloe Brownwright never met Medgar Evers, but said his assassination was a defining moment in her life.
His life inspired me to go on and run for political office. And in 1968, I was elected to a position in Madison County, thus becoming the first African-American female to be elected to a public office in Mississippi.
I was very fortunate.
50 years after his death, Merle Evers Williams keeps her husband's legacy alive with an institute dedicated to improving race relations.
We can talk about the flaws of society, and we can complain about it, but I hope we don't have to go through the negatives anymore. But how wonderful would it be if we could look at each other as human beings and not by the color of the skin?
Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Jackson, Mississippi.